Okay, thank you. We're now resuming at agenda item 6, members, which is a briefing by the British Deaf Association on the Sign Language Bill. Before we begin the briefing session, members, I would want to welcome the engagement thus far with the deaf community at our events on the bill, where the role of the committee and how to engage with us has been outlined. I would take this opportunity to highlight that the last of these sessions takes place tomorrow, Friday, at 11 a.m. in Banbridge Leisure Centre, and I would encourage attendance from as many committee members and members of the public as possible. And I want to once again acknowledge the work of the committee staff in facilitating this very extensive consultation process. So members, the briefing paper is at page 351, and you have also been provided with the following papers: a copy of the bill at page 358, the research paper at page 370, and delegated powers memorandum, which is page 429. So I'd now like to welcome the following representatives to the meeting: Dr. Robert Adam, who is BDA Chair; Majella McAteer, who is BDA Manager here in the North; and Tom Litchie, who is BDA Head of Policy and Research. So, hello all, and Robert, I invite you to make a brief opening statement, please, before we move to questions from members. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I might stand for my presentation. Thank you so much. Thank you. My name is Robert Adams. I am the chair of the British Deaf Association. I am so honoured to be here. It is such a meaningful day. It is such a huge journey here for the deaf community in Northern Ireland. And thank you so much for your work and your engagement with the deaf community here. And on your work on the Sign Language Bill. And importantly, this bill is recognising Irish Sign Language and British Sign Language. It's an incredible opportunity for us, and it is a momentous day for us here, and thank you for the invitation.
Now I'm going to switch over to use British Sign Language. I do want to introduce my colleagues. I have Majella McAteer here to my left. Majella has led all the work here in Northern Ireland. She has been working with the BDA for the last 28 years, so I can say that Majella knows more than anybody else whenever it comes to matters here in the north of Ireland. She understands all of the stresses, the celebrations, everything here about the deaf community in Northern Ireland. Like myself, Majella is bilingual. She uses both BSL and ISL, and today I think she's going to use BSL. This is also Tom Litchie, and he is our policy and research lead. He is the head of policy and research in the BDA. Now, Tom does all the heavy thinking, looks at all those complex issues that we face, and he helps us then, as the board and as a staff, to understand the landscape, to understand how policy changes can be made that improves the lives of deaf people, essentially in the real world. I want to share with you what it's like as a deaf person. There's two things that we have in common. One is that we use sign language. And sign languages, whichever sign language that is, are beautiful, expressive language that uses body language, facial expressions, and obviously hand movements as well. Sign languages are natural and indigenous languages from different countries throughout the world. And here we are very, very proud of our languages, both here in BSL and ISL. Now, we also face barriers and challenges day and daily. Not intentionally people being horrible or being difficult, but there are difficulties and challenges out there. I can't hear, so I can't hear my GP's advice. I can't go to my work and go to a staff meeting like anybody else can without accommodation. I can't phone my council and say that my bin wasn't collected this morning. And information that's on government websites isn't in my language. So deaf people are very important members of society, and we're not silent. You might not be able to hear our voice, but that doesn't mean we're silent. Information in society isn't something that we can take for granted like others can. We have to ask, we have to work really hard to make our rights become a reality, to get information in a way that we can digest. But we want more than just mere access. We want respect for our language. We want legal recognition of our language. And we want public bodies, by law, to allow us to communicate with them. But we do also want more than that. We want to contribute to society. We are citizens. We pay our taxes. We have a right to be given the same equality and the same standard of living as others. We want to become politicians like you. We want to become civil servants. We want to become leaders. There's maybe some young deaf people out there watching, and they want to get into politics. We want to work with others to create change so that people can achieve their potential and people can live like anybody else. We are passionate over teaching sign language to families of deaf children. That is so important. Language is so key, and language begins in the home. We bring our life experiences as deaf people, and we have the expertise of our life experience. And our vision is that deaf people will be designing and delivering and evaluating this change, and it will be done in conjunction with deaf people. We want to make sure we have rights to opportunities and life experience, and we want to contribute all that we have to the proceedings. Thank you for this opportunity to give this opening statement today.
Thank you. Okay, so a couple of questions then from myself, and I'll go to members then, just to remind members that Hansard are in the chamber for this agenda item. So can I ask, are there any aspects of the Irish or the Scottish Sign Language Acts which you would like to see replicated in this bill?
Let me respond. Northern Ireland is unique because we have two different sign languages in operation, as you can see today, both British Sign Language and Irish Sign Language. If you start to look across different areas, across England, Scotland and Wales, they have one, and those were started with a private members' bill. We are very grateful that the executive have put this bill through and that we're coming in with a stronger foothold. So I think it's a different context. Tom, you probably want to say something here.
I agree, Northern Ireland is very unique in its position here. It's an amazing opportunity for us to show respect and include both communities, so those using ISL and BSL, respect both equally. I think here we need to show how people really are using 4 different languages. We've got English, Irish, ISL, BSL, and how they can cohesively work together to create a better future for all of the community.
And if I can add to that, as people who live here, we want to have our own rights recognised through our own local legislation.
And I think that actually came across very strongly in the opening remarks, and I was reminded of the famous James Connolly saying, our demands most modest are, we only want the earth, and right, absolutely right you are, to have that respect and to have your language, and I agree in terms of their beauty, their expressiveness, and we're very lucky to have 2, not 1 but 2 here. So in your comments in relation to clause 2 of the bill, you state that building leadership capacity within the deaf community would lead more rapidly, effectively and cost efficiently to improved services and improved outcomes, and that the department should pick up this responsibility and set targets and timelines for progress. Do you feel this should be included within the bill itself, or is this an action that needs to happen after the bill is passed?
Just thinking about that, I think that if we look at what is happening across the whole community, we need capacity built within the community to deliver on this bill, because as deaf people, we on a daily basis face barriers and restrictions in our life. And we need to get some capacity building to ensure that people know how to create solutions and understand what those solutions would be. And that co-productive approach is what will be needed. So we need that capacity ready to deliver on that. Let me give you an example. You could have a department, the Department for Communities. I was seconded into that for 3 years. That's a lovely model of best practice. You have someone with lived experience working within the department. Also, I gained a lot of experience around how departments work, so I think that is such a beneficial approach.
I think we need to respect here the Northern Ireland Civil Services, how the concept will be delivered as envisaged by them. We have this legislation in place. So then 2 points that I'd like to make here. The first point is that I'd like to see a commitment. As Robert said, sign language issues need to be designed, need to be managed, need to be delivered, evaluated by deaf signers. The second point I'd like to raise is we'd like to see a commitment to making this really happen, to have a timeline of maybe a 5 or 4 year period, a pathway to develop capacity in Northern Ireland with the deaf community. And sorry, a third point I'd like to raise, the UN Council on the Rights of Disabled People, within their article, if you look at section 4.3, it states that the national government should be closely collaborating with the representative organisation of the disabled people they're willing to serve. The recent UN Committee on Disabled People made an announcement to clarify the definition of the word representative. They said, the representative organisation means the organisation with members who are majority disabled, staff members of all levels majority disabled, and board members who are majority disabled. So in our case, that means deaf signers, the majority being deaf signers. And of course, one national UK-wide organisation representing disabled people would match this criteria. And in Northern Ireland, this doesn't have to be the BDA. There are other organisations that match the same criteria successfully. But at the end of the day, we need to respect these criteria, and I'd really like to show the involvement of this specific definition within any agreement made.
And as a follow-up point, just recently there was a briefing from the Department for Communities on the 11th of April, I believe. And in there it's talked about the Sign Language Partnership Group, which is a really fantastic resource because it does have not only deaf people on that, but representatives from a range of government departments sitting in that group. And their task is to review this and to actually increase their membership and to include more deaf people in that to ensure that we go through smoothly and effectively this whole pathway and journey towards getting the necessary legislation in place.
Yourselves are an example of creating legislation. So in the past, people had good heart and good intention, but they didn't achieve their means. Around 15 years ago, UK Parliament passed legislation to support the development of a telephone relay service. So a system to support deaf people to make phone calls. At that time, it was called Type Talk. So that was created through a parliamentary act. And back then, when it was launched, it was a fantastic initiative. I remember the first time that I used this to make a telephone call, and I thought, finally, deaf people have access to the phone. You had that huge piece of tech that you laid your phone handle on top, and then you got through to the operator. I think the operators were based in Liverpool, and they would speak on your behalf, a hearing person. So the operator would take the phone call for you and type the information back to me. It was fantastic. I loved it. And then years later, as technology was improving and evolving, we had the internet come along, and mobile phones were dispersed, and Type Talk was actually incompatible with mobile phones. It was fixed telephony due to the Act. The rules were completely set in stone. Those people managing the delivery of these telephony services and evaluated them were all hearing. They didn't use sign language. They didn't rely on the service that they were evaluating. Therefore, their motivations were different with regard to evolution and technological changes. So for that reason, the whole system became an issue. So if you put down the concept of deaf leadership within your planning, deaf management, it means that with technological and societal changes, deliveries can evolve alongside them more quickly, more cost effectively.
Thank you. And the final one from me then, before I go to members' questions, is around Clause 5. And you have stated that there needs to be greater clarity around the definition of at least one person or group appearing to the department to be acting on behalf of the deaf community. As you point out, this could be open to interpretation. Do you feel that one group is framed as too few? And if so, what would be a better number? Or indeed, how do you think that should be defined or framed to be effective?
Are you happy for me to respond to that one? What I would say is one person may only give you one perspective. This is complicated how it gets translated into real life, isn't it? You could also have an individual who actually isn't part of the mainstream deaf community, who is also deaf, uses sign language, but they won't have a voice because that person won't know them. And so we need to be open to having adaptations depending on the experiences of a whole range of people out there across the whole of the deaf community. And we need to be able to be representative of the whole community. So I think this is a difficult one to negotiate, but there needs to be some clarity so that there's representation for everyone. And I think everyone needs to have a voice. Every deaf individual needs to have a voice. Somehow we need some kind of mechanism. If somebody, for example, in their local area wants access to a museum, not everybody would know about that. So how do we clarify this? How do we get the mechanisms in place?
I just want to ensure my answer matches your question. Could you repeat the question for me, please?
So the framing of at least of one person, at least one person or group appearing to the department to be acting on behalf of the deaf community, do you feel that's appropriate in terms of this legislation, or should that be framed differently to ensure appropriate feedback?
Thank you. I'd like to refer back to my previous point about the UN CRPD, so the criteria within as to how to define a representative organisation. I'm sure, do you want me to, I can repeat my previous point, or is it worthwhile doing so?
No, we have that point. Yes, we have that. Okay, thank you. Before I just leave, Tom, if I could just clarify in your other point that you made previously around the technology. So we're arguably currently in the wave of a new series of developments around AI, moving, as part of internet, but also beyond it in some ways. Is that something that needs to be future-proofed? And do you think within this bill that there is sufficient space to move with those developments?
You're absolutely right to ask so. The BDA have done a lot of work on BSL AI, so sign language AI. We've just released a discussion paper to do with sign language AI. So yes, we have positive and negatives involved. It could be an amazing tool for our community, but again, there are concerns alongside. So the controls of the tools, the ownership of the tools by those people who don't sign, potentially. So with the legislation, I don't think it doesn't need to specifically talk about technology, but the point about the criteria of deaf leadership within this, if you insert that, I'm confident we'd be able to support the deaf community in Northern Ireland to take that ownership, that management, that incorporation of technology into our daily lives, into the future.
Can I also respond, please? I want to add to that. At the moment, I mean, what I think is those people who are working with AI, there's no real AI technology that's safe that we have at the moment. So when it comes to government departments, some people think this is a great option, it's going to be quite cost effective, but I would say there's no safety in this area of technology at the moment. And you will only find that out if you speak to the right people, and those people are going to be deaf people who will be able to evaluate it. And sometimes people think it's cost effective, but whenever it comes to language, whenever it comes to access, we need quality. But those questions can always be answered in consultation with the whole deaf community, the deaf community as a whole. Yes, and I just want to add to that as well. If there are companies that are producing AI type language models, I was at a disability action meeting just a few weeks ago about AI. There was quite a lot of discussion there. And really it's looking at the companies. Those companies who are creating this technology need to have an ethical framework. And part of the ethics come from making sure deaf sign language users are involved to make sure that what is being produced is correct. Now, we're a little bit down the line at the moment, but AI is happening very, very quickly. There's a lot of developments, but we know exactly that it needs to be monitored. It's a long way off yet being adequate, so it does need to be very much in collaboration with the deaf community.
Yes, I support Majella's point as raised. So the deaf community, we have an interesting relationship with technology. So on one hand, we have a history of technology being forced upon us, run by non-sign language peoples. The concept of how deaf people should behave using technology that's forced upon us. And then on the other hand, we have the deaf community. There was some research about how quick we are to adopt new technology, to adopt things like subtitles, like type talk, like the texting mechanisms within mobile phones. The deaf community love to embrace new technology when it's under our control, when it matches what we need.
Thank you. So I'm now going to go to members of the committee, and I'm starting with Kelly and then coming to Morris. Kelly, go ahead, please.
Thank you. Thank you for coming to committee today. I was very interested when you said you want your rights to become a reality. So my question then is about clause 3 of the bill. How do you feel about the inclusion that affordability is one of the deciding factors whether or not sign language would be used, and should that be removed?
Okay, so let's go back to where all of those prescribed organisations are going to have to create a sign language action plan. And it's important in that to include deaf people in those discussions and those agreements. So that's where it is, so that they're not going to be making any decisions without input. So therefore, we'll be looking at priorities, what is needed, we'll be looking at tangible timelines, we'll be looking at how deaf people can monitor those action plans, and we will hope that that will become a regular thing. What do you think?
Yes, Majella raises an important point here. So the priority should be consultation with the deaf community as to what priorities we should be focusing on. So at that point, it could be the total expenditure of the Northern Ireland Government, of local councils on sign language access. What is the current total expenditure? With the discussion with the communities and deaf leaders, to look at the money to see if that could be spent in the best way, or are there more effective, cost-effective measures that are more suited to our needs. We don't want other people deciding what we need.
And to add to that, on an everyday basis, if a deaf person goes, for example, to the dentist, or if they have access needs in a care home or in their place of employment, they will need access. And to say that it's not affordable, we don't have enough money, that doesn't wash with the deaf community. It just doesn't. We have rights, and we have rights to access, and they should be seen.
Thank you for that. I share a concern that on the face of the bill, it gives organisations the opportunity to consider affordability before co-production. I don't understand if we are asking for action plans to be produced. Those action plans will include resourcing, which is the financing of communications. So I don't actually see the value of clause 3. You had talked as well there about the public services. Some of those public services are delivered by private companies. The list of potential public bodies will therefore not include private companies. Have you any suggestions how we could improve to ensure that communication is delivered?
So we can provide various examples from around the world of interpreter provision. So Robert Adam may know more about this. In Scandinavia, thank you, they have a specific number of hours for interpreting every year. So a deaf person can go use some of their hourly allowance for anything they please. In Australia, they have a different system supporting the deaf community to have involvement, for example, in local sports clubs, or they can have interpreter provision for a school appointment for their child, or maybe for a job interview. There are many different examples around the world of interpreter provision. We've had discussions as to what specifically would match the needs of the Northern Ireland and deaf services. That would need to be further explored.
I do want to respond to your point. If a public body then commissions a private company to carry out a service, obviously then what we will see is the public body really has that responsibility still. The responsibility lies with them to make sure that the service they're commissioning is accessible, whether that private company can or cannot afford it. Surely we expect then that the public body would still have that ownership of responsibility to provide access.
It might therefore be worthwhile on the face of the legislation, as well as public bodies, it is any organisation that is delivering services for that public body to be included. Yeah, okay. The last question.
Absolutely, just to agree with that, yes.
Last question I have. Part of the bill talks about provision of support for deaf children's family and carers and guardians, but it's completely silent on deaf schools. Do you think that we should be incorporating an element of support, given that this bill, this law, recognises sign language as a language and a culture, but it's silent on education in sign language?
So I am wary of specifically deaf schools because we are looking towards here a disability framework, and this is a language bill. I am supportive of including support for signing schools, sign language medium education methods that could be open to both deaf and coder children, and those children who prefer education through sign language could be an option.
I would just add in there that schools nowadays quite often are bringing in classroom assistants who are actually deaf themselves, so that within a mainstream setting a deaf child has that level of support in the school. So schools in general, there's a lot of work to be done, but in saying that, access is improving a bit. We've a long way to go, and there's a legacy issue here. However, if we looked at the prescribed organisations on that list, surely the Department of Education should have an obligation to do that in terms of looking at their services on a daily basis, because they're frontline. I think it might take a long time to work on some of these issues, but it does need addressed.
One of the biggest issues for the deaf community historically has been education, early years. So the BDA was set up 135 years ago by a group of deaf people concerned about deaf education. And for many, many years, the concerns still remain. So I agree. Thank you for raising this imperative issue, and to have that inputted into the bill would be advantageous.
And if I could also add that, you know, the BDA was established by an Irish man. It's a very important point that I put that on your records. It's crucial to say that. Just to come back to something Magella was referring to, we have school classroom assistants who can sign coming in, but we would really like to see deaf qualified teachers within the school system. That's what we really need to aim for. And if we're looking at a legislation and what's going to happen within that, spoken languages, if you're looking at legislation, there's vitality of the language and promotion of the language so that the language community itself can thrive and therefore it becomes a subject that people want to learn. So it's the vitality of the language itself. At the minute, sign language hasn't been included within the education system. Perhaps you could do something here in Northern Ireland that is totally unique by putting this within the legislation to ensure that sign language becomes part of the education system. It would be just wonderful to see that happening here in Northern Ireland. You could put yourselves on the world map as a world leader in deaf education if you do something really unique here.
Chair, just to follow up on Robert's comment, you mentioned the word promote. The Act, or the bill as it currently stands, does not define how it will be promoted. It says what it could do, but it doesn't define what that promote means. Would you like us to define that in legislation?
It is about recognising human rights, isn't it? Because language is a part of human rights, about respecting our language, that it is the language that we use every day. This is not about tokenism, it's about accepting this is our life. If there are no interpreters, we couldn't communicate with each other here today. There would be no opportunity. Because there are interpreters in the room today, we have the opportunity to all communicate with each other. Within the deaf community, we talk to each other all the time in sign language. You know, we chat day and daily with each other, and we want our human rights to be respected and acknowledged. And if you look at what's going on in other countries where they've got an act, there's choices, and we want choices. You know, and we want to have that on the basis of sign language. We live in a visual world, and we want to have that recognised and acknowledged. In terms of the promotion of sign language, that will be done if there are government initiatives, if there is a profile being developed for sign language, and that will be done through ensuring that you do have effective education of sign language, teaching families and children, deaf children's families and friends and networks how to use sign language. For example, a lot of you will know Rose, who was in Strictly Come Dancing. She's become a really important figure out there for us because her profile is so high across the national stage. We can see what's going on. Even the sign for thank you is now coming out and about. Our chair used it earlier on this morning. I really appreciate that. That wouldn't have happened 5-10 years ago. That's what promotion of sign language is, that it is out there in society, it is visible, it is being seen, and you are providing the framework and the structure for that to happen. So it's all of us working together on this matter. Magella's just saying, if you go on to Google and you put in Strictly Come Dancing when Rose won her award, within 3 days, Google had more than 200,000 people looking for sign language classes because it was all connected. You could go through the metrics and see how many people were trying to learn sign language as a result of what Rose did in Strictly.
Thank you for picking up on the term promotion. I think that's crucial. Our language isn't just a communication tool, it's a fully fledged language that has its own culture, its own history and heritage. So it's probably better to give this part of the action plan in collaboration with deaf-led organisations, those who can really break down what can be done to promote the language and what deaf people would like to see. One thing that I've noticed with regard to a gap, so we garnered feedback from parents of deaf children who were interested in learning sign language in order to communicate with their new babies. And sometimes when they meet teachers of the deaf or audiologists, the feedback they receive is extremely negative with regard to their opinions on sign language. So in Great Britain, it's a potential breach of the Equality Act 2010. But I know this doesn't apply to Northern Ireland, so possibly there is a legislative gap that we've identified here. So what would happen if a family received this negative opinion from professionals with regard to sign language, those who are working closely with the early years services? What are the possible implications and what can we do to improve these sorts of situations?
Thank you. Going to Morris then.
Thank you.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you very much for your presentation here this morning. Communication difficulties that you have outlined here are something that people like me take for granted. We don't experience them. So how big a disadvantage do you think the deaf community experience when trying to seek employment, etc.? And I read here in the papers that you may have to register as disabled to access communication services. How much of a disadvantage can that be? And do you think this bill will go a long way to address the communication problems?
Within Northern Ireland, I can absolutely 100% state that we are massively disadvantaged compared to the wider society. Any problem that anyone out there faces in getting a job, it's doubly hard for us. Our educational struggles mean that we come in with a lower level of qualifications, and then the communication issue is an automatic thing that employers just reject. They don't want to know. And therefore, what we're facing now is that deaf people going into employment, they do have to notify that they're deaf, and then automatically they can go through an access to work claim. And that does mean that they can go through an assessment, and then that will be, some people are aware of that, but there are other employers who, the amount of access work that you get really depends where you work. For some charities, you'll get it automatically. For some large-scale employers, they expect the employers to contribute to that. So I have an access to work support, and that gives me 16 hours per week of interpreter support for meetings and the whole range of other tasks that an interpreter can do with me. Anything to add to that, Tom?
So deaf people certainly experience many barriers in their jobs and their careers, and it's to do with the system itself. So obtaining the qualifications, being able to access informal networking, taking on voluntary opportunities and apprenticeships can be extremely difficult for us. The national model, having one deaf person within a non-signing work placement, again creates other issues with regard to microaggressions within the workplace. So if you bring in an interpreter to the workplace, that's fine. They've got formal working hours, but then during lunch break, during afternoon and morning breaks, they're missing out on information. And obviously for this interpreter to work these long hours can be quite draining. So I would say it's imperative for signers to work together in the same workplace. I'm not saying deaf people only, I'm saying hearing people as well. A signing environment where we share the same language and we can support each other within the professional workplace.
Also, to respond to that, it is especially difficult for deaf people who are not in high professional jobs. I don't know a better way to word that, but if a person works maybe in manual labour, factory work, a shop, they will never get access to work. And they need to be able to try and get that access to work, try to book interpreters. But it's a lot of admin for somebody like that to have to deal with. if they even get access to work in the first place. Like Tom is saying there, all of that incidental conversation, chit-chat, which is so important, that isn't there. Maybe health and safety information. A lot of really key information isn't being picked up because deaf people are in the workplace very much limited by their access to work, and therefore, as a result of that, they're missing out on a lot. There's people who work in Amazon, in the gig economy. There's a lot of people who feel very much those challenges and those difficulties in the workplace. It is a massive problem for us.
I find this,
Robert rightly, mentioned, with regard to deaf people's careers. So to even obtain a job, to be able to have the skills in order for them to operate within the workplace, to get their first promotion, especially high-level jobs, there are definitely huge barriers there.
Chair, I find this an absolutely fascinating presentation, perhaps one of the most enjoyable ones that I have witnessed on this committee. I'm a firm believer that success only comes when you bring people with you. If you do things to people or do things for people, it seldom garners support or success. Therefore, it's important that sign language users are engaged and included on any aspect, should that be legislation or technology advances, and I encourage you to keep being engaged. One final question, Chair. I would be keen to see sign language taught at school to everyone, and especially primary schools, because children have the ability to learn quicker and be more acceptable to new things than we adults. So can I ask you, what are your thoughts on sign language being taught as part of the curriculum to all children, irrespective of whether they're a sign language user or not?
If I could respond, that's a very interesting topical question. I work in Heriot Watt University in Edinburgh. I train interpreters, I teach deaf studies, and I do a lot of research as well. And that is a question I will ask students. I will say to my interpreting students, why did you get into sign language and why do you want to be an interpreter? And they say, well, maybe I went to school with a deaf person, I learnt some sign language when I was at school. So there you can see that embedding that with school children, embedding the language, the experiences, does have lasting effects, and it can then contribute to the deaf and the interpreting economy, and obviously then wider society. So these are professional jobs, and I do believe that teaching children language in schools, specifically sign language, BSL and ISL, can massively increase opportunity. Absolutely, I want to agree with that. There's Craighead Primary School here in Belfast. They have about 15 deaf children in their unit there, the deaf unit. And the headmaster is extremely committed and brings a tutor into the school 1 or 2 days a week to teach the hearing students sign language, which makes the whole environment inclusive, means those deaf and hearing children can communicate at ease. And that's a fantastic model, I do believe, because deaf children feel respected, they feel empowered, and then we're looking at increasing interpreter capacity in the future. Recently, we've been looking at the GCSE BSL in England, and what we hope is to see that, and then that will roll over to here as well. There are plans in the pipeline, we just need to make sure they happen.
Thank you both for that. I do agree with both statements made here. So just to go back a little bit, the education in schools for all children of sign language is a wonderful model that I would support. The acquisition of language, the connections children make through language. So linked with deaf children within mainstream schools, having all hearing children learn level 1 or level 2 BSL would be marvellous, but I don't want us to miss the concept of language fluency. Deaf children also need to be with their peers who have signing fluency, who have high acquisition of language, so they can mix effectively, they can express themselves, they can have adequate structure of thought. And in schools, I think it might be too late. I think the first day these children are born, the day of deaf children being recognised as deaf, is when sign language should be provided. Within the NHS, they are rolling out more and more genetic testing, more and more diagnostic technologies. And at the moment, antenatal services do genetic analysis for all babies born, and in the future, it could be even a pre-birth screening. So when a woman is pregnant, the child within her belly may be identified as deaf. That's a great opportunity for them to start learning sign language immediately. So these children already have sign language before they enter school, and the attitudes of those parents are garnered as positive from the day that child is born. I think it's so important to have this deaf involvement within the early years sector.
Chair.
Thank you. And so I'm going to come now to our Deputy Chair, Nicola Brogan. I also, Melissa, just to let you know, we do have your indication. You'll be after Nicola, and then I'm coming to Brian. So just to ask members to, and it is absolutely a brilliant session, but we are, as ever, under pressure of time. So we've just asked members to take that into account, please, as well.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you for attending here this afternoon this morning. I must agree with Morris. I think this has been a really excellent briefing, and I think we've all learned a lot, and I think we've got a good understanding, or better understanding, of the challenges that the deaf community face, but also the opportunities that are there. And I do hope, Robert, as you said in your opening remarks, that young people from the deaf community are watching on and do feel inspired by you. And I hope that the sign language bill, and the fact that we're talking about the bill and the challenges that face the deaf community, remove some of the barriers for the deaf community, because you certainly deserve it. Robert, you also made reference in your opening remarks about the fact that any of these changes, this law and changes to policy, and that must be made in conjunction with the deaf community. So I just wonder, do you feel so far that you yourself and your voice has been heard, and the voice of the British Deaf Association, in regards to this sign language bill?
I think Majella is probably best placed to respond to that, because she is based here in Northern Ireland. We had the framework, this is separate to this, but that started back in 2004. It was whenever sign language was officially recognised. But obviously at that point, it was just recognition. And we wanted more than just a mere recognition that our language exists, essentially. Deaf Answers was then commissioned to create a roadmap to find evidence and feedback from the deaf community, from professionals, from a number of people, to see what we wanted set up. And that's where the idea of sign language legislation came up. Obviously, Scotland and England have their legislation, South of Ireland, but we haven't had ours. Which is why now, in 2016, we went out to consultation. At that consultation, a lot of people were involved, and that was the first time ever where Facebook was used, and the BDA in conjunction did that with DFC. What was Decal then, I think? But anyway, Decal. And we created, we had 360 videos from the deaf community who told us what they wanted. And that's very strong evidence. And that journey has been ongoing. The Sign Language Partnership Group is also there. Now, we understand that with different reasons that this has stalled along the way in the last 10 years. But now we're seeing it moving, and it's great to be here in this position.
That's really good, and I'm glad then that you feel that you have been able to be part of the production of this here in that case, even though it has taken some time. At least we're on the right tracks now. In regards to the bill, I just want to ask about clause 5. I know we've talked again about the consultation part and about the department liaising with other groups, but there's another part in clause 5 that mentions the department and prescribed organisations to have regard to the guidance when providing information and services. Do you think that have regard is strong enough, or should departments and prescribed organisations be compelled to follow the guidance, essentially?
Just to go back a little bit to the prescribed organisations, I think it will be up to them to develop action plans. And so a lot of this will need to be done in conjunction with the regulations. So again, that'll need the deaf community involved at every stage, contributing to this. We need, because deaf people understand their lived experience and know what their priorities are, so it all needs to be done collaboratively.
So I would agree with your point raised here. So the word regards potentially is not strong enough. I'm not standing to guess which strong word should be used. I respect your experience, and I respect the advice from civil servants with regard to any matters such as this. But the history of governments across the UK consulting, getting feedback, and then ignoring it becoming a tokenistic exercise, has happened. So I understand the concerns you've raised there.
I would agree with that, and I think it's something we need to be mindful of and careful of. But I do want to thank you again for attending here today. I think it's been really, really worthwhile and very powerful, so thank you. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Deputy Chair. And Melissa, we're coming to Melissa, who is on Zoom with us today. Go ahead, Melissa, please. Thank you.
Báilte Óvalig, you're all very welcome here today. It's Jas Bula Livsha Arish. It's nice meeting with you again. Agus Gahaira at the Michelle or Magella. Well, Michelatha Strabane. I met with you in Strabane, Magella, when you were there with the consultation that we had.
You did indeed meet. It's nice to see you again.
Yeah. And that it's ironic, you know, that given the amount of discussion that we have in relation to language and its culture and the importance of its visibility, that it is in this bill that in many ways that we highlight the importance of language, and that it isn't a threat to anyone, but it enriches us all when we can communicate with each other. And I would hope that in this bill, and yet and all, I'm not convinced that it will, but I'd hope that in this bill that it will create an environment that will allow, in particular, those who don't have sign language or don't depend on sign language, that they will embrace it and that there'll be a greater understanding throughout the wider population. And in fact, the recommendation that Morris made there, I thought that was excellent as well, that it should be included in the curriculum within schools and so on. So to what extent do you believe yourselves that, within this bill, that that it will make that positive contribution to greater understanding by the wider community and its responsibilities in relation to the needs of the deaf community, but then in particular to be able to directly communicate with them as well, or to basically understand them. It's not that one has to be fluent, no more than one has to be fluent in Irish to be able to understand at times the importance of its level of communication.
Well, I think in terms of best practice guidelines, you know, we need to look at what's happening across all the public bodies. And of course, there will be strategy involved in all this in terms of how this will be launched, the commitments that will be there, how to ensure that the presence of the bill is across. I believe once it actually goes live, you'll be surprised on the day to see what happens. There will be a crowd of deaf people outside on the hill cheering. There will be a lot of people. This will be very visible. You know, it'll be a massive event for us to celebrate, to feel that we've actually achieved something in Northern Ireland. I think we're coming back to this word we've discussed already. It's about promotion. Promoting through action plans, promoting through teaching sign language in schools, promoting through ensuring that deaf children and their families and support networks have that, promoting through ensure that the media incorporate BSL and ISL, Magella's saying, and things like Strictly Come Dancing showing what a profile can do, and perhaps including more deaf people in these competitions in the future would be a good idea.
Yeah, just to add the point with regard to engagement linked to your previous questions. So, creating a plan, a wonderful concept, but then the implementation becomes priority following. So, through some feedback, we know that implementation through co-production sometimes works, sometimes doesn't. We've had co-production projects at the BDA across the UK that aim at the deaf community, and we have struggled. We've had one partner that's a community representative using sign language, and then the local authority or council worker or government representative not being a fluent signer. So 2 chairs, 2 co-partners that don't have a common language between them creates a barrier and therefore creates problems. And then on the other side of the project, we have time spent educating non-signing people. So the project fails to move on because we have these education pieces that need to be done first. In Welsh Government, they're currently doing a co-production project called the BSL Stakeholder Group, which is deaf person-led. I am the chair myself with a civil servant representative from Wales. He himself is a fluent signer and deaf. And wow, I must say, for the first time in my life, a co-production project is working exceptionally well, moving quickly and effectively and achieving its aims. And that's certainly one element that you could aim to achieve, and then aim for, so with respect, more background documentation supporting these endeavours. So from government departments, having a deaf signing person within them, learning about the internal work within the team, and that certainly can be delivered if this sort of person was to be put into place.
And just finally, do you think then, in order for this bill to be effective, that it requires a ring-fenced budget for the promotion, not only of the bill, but the development and understanding of sign language?
Magella said, I don't know how your government budgets work, but
We certainly welcome the opportunity to have the deaf community, deaf professionals have more involvement in the economic process. So making spending decisions, having assessments of the best and most effective use of money. Yes, I think a framework upon this would be fantastic.
Magella is saying, to be honest, there needs to be an investment in, as we've talked about, deaf leadership. That capacity building will require funding. And there are many developments. So family signing at home in Northern Ireland has been one of the best projects ever. It's been running for over 10 years now. And that includes, you can have accredited routes for parents of deaf children from level 1 up to level 6, that they are learning sign language. That's being delivered by another organisation. BDA are delivering this 10 to 20 week programme. This is sign language in the family environment, in their own home. We had a deaf child recently was being taxied to school, and they brought the taxi driver into the family at home sign language session so the taxi driver could communicate with the deaf child. This is an investment that works. That's realistic. Rob was just saying, life isn't free. When you're going to develop these things, then you've got to put aside money to pay for them. And Magella's saying, I think we've really potential to be world leaders here if we can invest this, put the right kind of investment in place.
I must mention, sorry, let me go back. We at the BDA have commissioned academic research from a think tank called RAND, R-A-N-D, who are extremely informed on matters of economy, and they've created a huge economic model on how sign language can be beneficial to the economy and what the implications are of making changes in expenditure in different areas linked to sign language. The work is not yet finished, but we are extremely excited about its results. It should be released later this year, and we're very happy to show these results to you.
Thank you ever so much.
Thank you, Melissa. And it's a point really well made on the resource. I have to say my interest in sign actually predates even becoming an MLA. 3 times I tried to apply to courses in my local college to learn it, and on all of those 3 occasions it was already oversubscribed, which tells me that demand was already outstripping supply at that time, and we certainly hope as a result of this bill that demand will grow as a result of expectation, rightly growing. So I haven't been able to get back to that since I became an MLA, but it's still on my to-do list, and I fully, and it's in terms of the expressiveness of the language and the beauty of it is what attracts me to it, I have to say. So Brian, please.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you all for your attendance today. This has been very informative and educational for me, and I think all of us. I want to ask Tom, you said earlier about a gap in equality legislation for children of a deaf child. Can you explain that again? I mean, there is under Clause 2, it talks about provision of classes for deaf children and their close families. Will that address that gap, or can you clarify if you think something else will be missing?
Yes, I was referring to the Equality Act 2010. There's a section called additional public sector responsibilities. So part of it talks about encouraging the understanding between disabled and non-disabled peoples. So if a professional working in the local authority or within NHS services, within their professional capacity, says critical statements about sign language. So, for example, parents have been told that, the doctor said, if your child learns sign language, it will never learn to speak, which in itself is completely incorrect. From research, we know this simply isn't true.
Absolutely. Can I add to this, actually, and this about the background? Most children who are diagnosed deaf are in a medical setting. Generally here, it'll be the NHS or a local health centre. But it is a medical setting. As a result, people will come at this through a medical lens. They will probably say, "We're so sorry, your child is deaf." And those comments really give an idea of a misconception of that deaf child in the future. And that's where we don't have that legislation. Here, within the Equality Act, that is something that you cannot say. You cannot say basically mythical information that if your child learns to sign, they won't learn to speak, because that is incorrect. So that is where that safeguards that sort of narrative.
So there's two elements here of misconception. So the criticism of sign language generally, parents now raise complaints due to the Equality Act over discrimination against sign language. So here, and also hearing and deaf segregation. And another issue, which isn't really linked to the Equality Act, but we have a lot of new research emerging showing that deaf babies who learn sign language early, actually this supports their speech skills later. Therefore, there is no reason to exclude sign language from their initial language development. This fear over speech, actually, it's the opposite. Sign language supports speech. There's a myriad of evidence backing this up.
Okay. So I think you're saying that there should not be any suggestion or recommendation against the learning of sign language. Is that right?
Yes, thank you. Taking me back to my initial point, I apologise for going off a little bit there. Yes. So it's about the embedded criticism of sign language. So how do we protect our language? How do we protect our deaf people and deaf children? How do we protect our hearing parents from these attitudes, these negative attitudes towards deafness and sign language? And I think the public generally are very positive. So if we look at those staff working in the NHS and in early years, they're really positive people, but actual frontline lived experience of parents, those trying to learn, those trying to understand what's the best option for their deaf baby, I think we know from their direct voices there are implicit issues here. So it doesn't seem that the legislation covers these inherent issues within the early diagnosis of deaf children.
Yes, and it really comes down to informed choice. Sign language should be one of those choices that parents are given when their baby is diagnosed as deaf. That should be information that is provided at the point of diagnosis. Within the framework, and hopefully within our legislation, then there will be an early years pathway that is developed after the legislation. So there will be the hope that that would be included there.
One way of potentially revising this element could be to add a line to say, those professionals working within government and local authorities have accountability to be fair, to be supportive of all languages.
And just, I suppose, to summarise, I have met so many deaf people who said, oh, I wish I'd learnt sign language when I was smaller. I wish my parents knew sign language. The problem was they never met a person that was fortunate enough to give them that opportunity. So that's really a summary of that.
So we call this language deprivation. So for a hearing child, language deprivation is exceptionally rare. It almost never happens, but for a deaf child, it's extremely common. Language deprivation is real. And this is due to the systemic focus on the teaching of spoken language and withholding sign language until the child then fails to speak, and then offering it as a last-minute addition. But it's the consequences of accepting failure to give sign language to these deaf children. You don't want these parents to feel that they failed. They're only human. It's the wrong sort of intention. It shouldn't be like that. All deaf children should be able to be given all tools of language, to be able to read, to be able to write, to be able to speak, to be able to sign. Give deaf children everything.
Thank you. I have one other question, Madam Chair. In clause 5(3), it says when the department is issuing guidance, this was referred to earlier, the department must consult with each of the prescribed organisations, but only be at least one person or one group appearing to the department to be acting on behalf of the deaf community. This seems poor wording. Can you tell us about how the deaf community is organised in Northern Ireland? Should prescribed groups will be listed? Should deaf community groups be listed there? Or is it a complicated picture, or is there a fairly representative structure? Is it yourself? Is it BDA? Or
Again, I would say to follow the UNCRPD criteria on this as to what really a representative organisation or person is. How do you identify these people, these organisations? I think for the UK, the DDPOs, disabled people's organisations, they have their own interpretation in the UK of the UNCRPD criteria, and both frameworks are extremely useful aids. And I think if the DFC were to identify which groups they were best placed to be actually honest representations, to really reflect authentic views of the deaf community.
Can I add the Sign Language Partnership Group? There are many, many deaf organisations represented there, and many, many deaf individuals represented there. Their constitution is going to be reviewed and will be revised with the hope of bringing in more deaf people to the Sign Language Partnership Group. That is ongoing work at the moment, so there will be changes there to coincide with the bill going through. So that's positive.
okay, thank you.
Thank you, Brian. And if I could just to flag up that officials, we will follow up with Craig Primary School just to ensure that engagement is offered there, so that to flag that. The other thing I want to briefly, if I could, touch upon is the inclusion of what are known as Henry VIII powers within the bill, and there are certainly that will allow the department to make regulations and will provide the department with some flexibility to do that. But it may mean that there wouldn't be the same level of scrutiny. So would you have any concerns around the level of Henry VIII powers contained within the bill?
I can understand that there are concerns around this. However, I would say the Department for Communities are very well known within Northern Ireland to the local deaf community. I think if you look at the rest of the UK and the government structures there, they have sat with, normally it has been under departments like Department for Work and Pensions, who are very remote. This has been under the Department for Culture and Arts and Leisure. The fact that they are in that structure alongside other languages means that there are experts there who have been working with the deaf community for over 20 years, who are taking that responsibility on. There are officials who've been working since 2004 looking at these issues and addressing these issues. Now, of course, we need to ensure that we have deaf people involved, actively involved throughout the process. But I think if we move on to another government department taking this on, we'd be starting to reinvent the wheel and starting from scratch, whereas they have a relationship with the deaf community and have had a leadership involvement with them.
This legislation proposed in Northern Ireland is simply amazing. It's the first of its kind. And why do I say that? In Scotland, we have legislation through a private member's bill. And the same happened with UK legislation. That was through a private member's bill. And then the current Welsh proposal of legislation is also through a private member's bill. So a very similar process for all three. Here in Northern Ireland is completely different. This has full government backing and is unique in its way. This means we can't get everything right the first time. I don't know if you remember earlier I mentioned the example of Type Talk. So the legislation created this technology to be frozen. It couldn't be updated, it couldn't be adjusted. And that specific situation, I think, would justify Henry VIII powers, because it would allow the Department for Communities, through experience and learning, to make adjustments as and when.
Okay, thank you. And final, really brief one. Are there any amendments that you would like to see in the bill? A brief question, but maybe not as brief an answer.
We would be delighted to see something about the education of deaf children to ensure that language acquisition is ensured for deaf children. That is what could really make the biggest impact on the deaf community in Northern Ireland and wider society in Northern Ireland for both BSL and ISL, is the acquisition of their language and ensuring that that happens effectively.
I completely agree with Robert here. It's imperative that deaf children, that deaf babies, their families, from the day of recognition, are given sign language for the best outcomes in their future. So if we allow this language acquisition, I think the huge potential for the change for deaf children and the future of the deaf community.
Okay, thank you. Thank you all. That has been a really excellent session, I have to say, and it's given us much food for thought in relation to this. Like you, we welcome, I think as a committee, very strongly welcome the department bringing this bill forward. I would ask you to continue to encourage everyone throughout the community to continue to engage through the process, to inform and educate us as to how we can make this the best bill that it possibly can be, to create a situation whereby people are not saying, we're sorry to hear your child is deaf, but rather that we will ensure there will never be discrimination against your child who is deaf, and that they will experience the full range of activities that the rest of us enjoy. So thank you for that. If I could ask the panel just to stay in your seats, we're going to come out of broadcasting for a short period of time to set up for the next session, but if I could ask the panel to remain in their seats and ask the clerk to...
Did the committee agree to the suspension?
Pardon?
Did the committee agree?
Our committee can tend to agree, yeah.